The HRD newsletter, of course, is a very interesting story. The HRD newsletter was first started as a newsletter of the Center for Human Resources Development of XLRI. So Father Abraham shifted for completing his PhD to Ahmedabad along with me in the year 1985. So practically the Center for HRD at XLRI existed for namesake, while it was being run from Ahmedabad by Father Abraham. Father Abraham main activity for the center was to promote the HRD newsletter. And HRD newsletter was a very powerful tool of continuing to communicate the HRD philosophy, HRD concepts and practices. And the way we managed the newsletter without any financial support from XLRI itself is itself very interesting. We worked out a strategy that every newsletter should consist of a profile, a HRD profile of a company that sponsors it. So we will pick up only those companies where some good HRD work is going on, because our interest was to disseminate the HRD concepts. Therefore, we will pick up a good company. The first itself was sponsored by L&T, and therefore it had a profile of L&T there. The second newsletter was sponsored by State Bank of Patiala. This is because I was working with State Bank of India. Both Uday and I worked with State Bank of India. And Mr. Shanmugam, who happened to be the deputy, um, uh, I think at that time he was chief general manager of HRD at State Bank, posted as managing director of State Bank of Patiala. And he wanted to do a lot of work. And from XLRI, I used to go to State Bank of Patiala and help him in organizing a few HRD activities. So Mr. Shanmugam became a good friend of mine, and therefore I requested him to sponsor the next newsletter. The second newsletter was sponsored by State Bank of Patiala. The third newsletter was sponsored by Sundaram Clayton. The fourth newsletter by Hindustan Petroleum Corporation. The next one by MMTC, and so on. It goes on to different companies. The arrangement was that each newsletter will talk about the profile of HRD practices of that company. For example, in State Bank of Patiala, we talked of State Bank of Patiala, and at the same time, we also will have one conceptual article. In the first paper where L&T's HRD was profiled, we presented conceptual paper of integrated HRD systems. In State Bank of Patiala, the the conceptual paper was on HRD climate. In fact, by the time we conducted a HRD climate survey, and we talked of how to measure HRD climate, where Father Abraham and I were doing a lot of work on HRD climate, and our HRD climate questionnaire is quite well known. And the third newsletter of Sundaram Clayton uh, was had a profile of HRD in Sundaram Clayton, and there were a number of things, including I think a target oriented training and development process, that was one article. HRD uh, quality circles and Madura codes was another article, and so on. So there will be conceptual articles in the HRD newsletter, plus caselets and news. These were the 4 or 5 main constituents of a newsletter: a profile of a company, and a conceptual kind of an article, caselets of some good HR practices, and HRD news. It's largely in HRD news we would put HR related programs conducted by XLRI, programs conducted by IIM Ahmedabad, or programs planned for the National HRD Network. Mind you, between 95 February, March, where HRD network was conceptualized, and 1986 December, when it was actually finally registered, this was almost about a year and 8 9 months. During that practically 20 months, a lot of work had gone into HRD network. One of the things that had gone was networking, going, visiting chapters, mobilizing people to disseminate HRD concepts. Second is this particular kind of a newsletter. Third is enrolling members. We enrolled members free of cost. Simply, I think anyone who is interested in becoming a member, in fact, in the third issue, published in, when it was published, published in February 1986, we printed a form where we invited people to become members. So all that they need to do is to fill in the form and send it to me at Ahmedabad address with a copy to Center for HRD at XLRI Jamshedpur. So anybody, including I remember at that point of time there were a few uh, the secretaries, that is the stenotypists who became members, and people started raising questions that how do we admit a stenotypist as a member of HRD network? Is that any human being who is interested in developing his or her own potential in any kind of a setting can be member. So there is no hard and fast rule that you should be a trained HR professional and so on. Of course, there were a lot more restrictions, etc., that came up much later. But essentially, we said the HRD is for all. It is not meant for only so-called degree holders and things like that. That is the kind of concept we had. And the way we disseminated was we requested the sponsor. Sponsor was not to give us any money. We didn't want any money. We only wanted the reimbursement of the expenses. Now, what are the expenses? For printing the newsletter, there will be expenses. For mailing the newsletter, there will be expenses. So every time we printed about 2,000 copies and mailed them, and only the mailing charges, whatever were the charges, printing and mailing charges. And of course, each company which sponsors, it will be written there as their own company, sponsored by Sundaram Clayton, sponsored by MMTC, etc., etc. Each one of the organizations that sponsored the newsletter are the ones with whom I was helping from IIM Ahmedabad as a part of IIM's consulting assignments or as a part of some training programs and so on. So that is how I think of Sundaram Clayton. Of course, in the case of MMTC, I was not doing any work for MMTC. Mr. Raghavan happened to visit and lecture in one of the programs at IIM Ahmedabad. I met him personally and requested him, can you sponsor uh, this newsletter? I think if I recollect, same thing may have happened with the ONGC. They may have sponsored one of the newsletters. So this is the way I think we disseminated. So each newsletter was mailed free of cost to almost about 2,000 people, and this continued almost for about 3 years. So that means the first 10 to 12 volumes of HRD newsletter was mailed free of cost with the sponsorship from corporations, and that is the way we went on enrolling HRD network members. And the free form is still available in the HRD newsletter issue 3. And Father Abraham, working for his PhD at IIM while he was at IIM Ahmedabad, would stay with Loyola Hall, St. Xavier School, and use the Loyola Hall students, St. Xavier students, to, uh, after we get the newsletter printed, to insert the newsletter into envelopes, to post their their mail IDs. Those days there was no email, of course. We would only get cycloside copies of addresses, cut them, and paste them to the envelope. And Father Abraham actually had done a lot of physical labor in terms of getting the newsletters mailed to people. We also ran programs. HRD Network didn't have its own identity because we are now promoting HRD Network. So therefore, you can run a program, you can announce a program and run the program, but you cannot. You will have to necessarily collect the funds from with some agency. So that is where Center for HRD at XLRI became a great help, because any program that we run, the funds will be collected by Center for HRD at XLRI. Of course, at that time, Father Romuald Father D'Souza was kind enough to agree that anything that you earn on behalf of the Center for HRD can be spent for HRD center's purposes. It need not be combined with the XLRI's other budget and so on. So that was a great help for us. We were running training programs, so some money was saved as a part of the HRD center at XLRI. So this is how the original funding was done. It is, I think, this is the thing which led to the first landmark conference of the National HRD Network, which was organized at Chennai. That was the time I started working with both I myself and Professor Arun Monappa from IIM Ahmedabad were helping the Steel Authority of India to implement their performance appraisal system. It was internally designed, but we were requested to implement, and both Arun and I used to go to SAIL. And that is how we actually got in touch with Mr. Nair, who became later a good friend. And of course, Dr. Krishnamurthy was a great supporter of whatever effort that we were trying to do to promote HRD, because even when we talked of performance appraisal with SAIL, we talked of the HRD approach to performance appraisal, because our entire HRD in L&T was born out of revision of the performance appraisal system and so on. So there was quite a bit of these kinds of conceptual kind of linkages with this. So I must say the landmark, therefore, that made a lot of difference in making HRD network popular was the first conference. We conceptualized the first conference. A recent experiences in HRD was held in February 1985, and we said sometime in 1986 we should register the HRD network, and by about 87 we should probably hold the first conference. So 86 December we registered. Since I think we were promoting the concepts of HRD, we had Anil Khandelwal, KK Verma, who happened to participate. They were both in Bank of Baroda Staff College. Father Abraham was with me, and Chandrasekhar was frequently visiting Ahmedabad IIM. So five of us therefore got together and conceptualized the conference, Alternative Strategies of Human Resources Development. And it took almost a year for, I think, working on this conference. I have two influences I must share at this point of time. There were two factors that were influenced me in setting certain kind of standards for the first conference of National HRD Network. First was the amount of money some of my colleagues in OB area spent in organizing an international conference on social development. I think by 86 I became the chairman of the postgraduate program at IIM, and I was a member of the policy planning committee in IIM Ahmedabad. And a fact bill for secular styling costs incurred for conducting this international program on social development came to the policy planning committee. And when we discussed in policy planning committee, we discovered that 200 copies were made and almost a lakh and odd was spent simply in cyclostyling. That is when I said to myself, if I can get the same thing printed, 500 copies with the same money, I would go for printing a book rather than having a cyclostyle copy. So I think an experience from IIM set me to think of establishing a new benchmark of publishing a book before the conference. In fact, in this particular conference organized by Professor Khandwala, which was a wonderful conference where we had people like Golumbisky from USA, Robert from Brown from Boston, a large number of people came. It was a great conference, but papers were circulated in cyclostyle material. So it was a source of inspiration for me. If I hold a conference, I will have printed material distributed to people. The same thing happened when I was invited to be a keynote speaker of ISTD. So I think these were the two experiences which made us to think. When I mentioned this to Anil Khandelwal, he put us in touch with Rawat, Mr. Rawat of Rawat Publications, who readily agreed to print and give us 200 copies at 25 rupees a copy. He said, I'll give you I'll price it at 50 rupees. Subsequent copies, 50% of it will be paid as royalty to the National HRD Network. By the time we registered HRD Network, we got the first book of the alternative approaches and strategies of HRD printed, and when we held the conference, it was a remarkable thing. In my next part of this video, I'll talk of some highlights of the first conference of National HRD Network.